The number one thing candidates underestimate in job interviews is how easy to read they are to any of their interviewers. Okay, to people interviewing for a living, you are basically like an open book during these job interviews. Of course, exceptions apply, but I wanted to bring this up to your attention because you really want to understand your chances, if you want to bias them, so to speak, during these events. Okay, so how can you know how good you are at biasing people in interviews? The simple way to find out would be through a role play session. Okay, if you role play, then you will understand, you will build the skill to read the other person, your interviewer or your interview coach, to understand really how they react to what you're saying and understand how good you are at biasing people towards you in job interviews. In my experience, there's very few candidates not having something to hide, so to speak, in these job interviews. It could be that you rewarded your answers using AI. It could be that you maybe inflated some metrics. It could be that you don't want to talk about certain uncomfortable experiences and the like. So long story short, do a role play if you want to find out how easy to read you are and how good you are at reading your interviewer. Okay, the second thing I like to share with you that candidates underestimate during these job interviews is to set the right expectations based on the type of interview you're preparing for, right? If you're preparing for a phone screening round with a recruiter, and if you've been networking for that role, then it's highly unlikely they're going to perform a deep dive on your subject matter expertise on some project that happened 10 years ago. So preparing for deep dives isn't necessarily as relevant as maybe, making a good impression, introducing yourself well, reading the room, so to speak, in order, to set the stage for the final interview rounds. Similarly, when you're interviewing for a final interview round, if you're interviewing with someone who's a subject matter expert, of course you would expect them to grill you on the technical side. Yes, maybe some behavioral questions, but that's not going to be the main thing. On the other hand, if you're interviewing with a VP, your expectations will differ from that job interview in the sense that, hey, with the VP, it's more likely to be a behavioral interview than a purely technical one. And you'll be surprised how candidates have a tendency to prepare what they like for these interviews versus what matters for them. So in a similar way, if you're interviewing with a manager for a manager level role, you would expect them to ask you typical manager level questions based on how senior the role you're applying for is, right? And these examples could go on, but long story short, try to make an educated guess when it comes to the questions you're going to get asked during your job interviews, and don't over-rely, so to speak, on guidance, from public resources, from recruiters, or from anyone else from that matter. Try to use critical thinking because these questions are quite predictable nowadays, right? And the third thing I like to talk about here is with respect to empathy. Okay, empathy is something that another good number of candidates underestimate when it comes to these job interviews. And if I put it in the simplest possible way, is that it's highly unlikely that your interviewer will take a risk with you if they think that you're someone a bit arrogant, so to speak. For example, if they perceive you as you didn't take their final interview seriously, that will come across as you being arrogant towards them, right? And they will have to take a risk, and which is highly unlikely to happen. Similar way, if you interrupt your interviewer, it might be, that you are stressed out, maybe you want to hurry, maybe you want to, make a very strong impression and the likes. That similarly might not come across as you would expect during these job interviews. And the most classic example of people looking for empathy on how you and your work ethics would be the conflict questions. Do you enjoy working in teams? How do you handle conflict? And these types of questions is when a good number of candidates struggle to give answers that are sufficiently interesting for their interviewers, let alone if I'm not talking about the basic scenario where you shoot yourself in the foot because you're a toxic employee, but some candidates simply don't give senior enough answers for the type of role that they're applying for. So long story short, the message of empathy, especially going with a high-performing company, for most candidates it will be a privilege to get into these roles, and this must show in your performance during the job interview. So I hope you found this useful, and thank you very much for watching.